Piracy in the Caribbean, the Golden Age. Audio story transcript. Welcome. Come, step out of the noise of the modern world and listen to the sea. For centuries, this sea, the Caribbean, was the lifeblood of empires. Its turquoise waters were a liquid highway, carrying the plundered wealth of the New World back to the Old: silver from Peru, sugar from Barbados, tobacco from Virginia. And where there is immense wealth, there are always those who will risk everything to take it. Forget the maps where "Here be monsters" is written. The real story of the Caribbean was not about mythical krakens, but about men and women of flesh and blood. Desperate, defiant, and, for a brief, blazing moment, free. This is the story of the Golden Age of Piracy. It is not a romance of buried treasure chests and talking parrots. It is a story of rebellion, of brutal naval discipline, and a surprising form of democracy that flourished under the black flag. This is the story of piracy in the Caribbean. Chapter 1: The Birth of the Brethren. It did not begin with the skull and crossbones. It began with smoke. In the early 1600s, the vast Spanish Empire claimed almost all of the Caribbean. But their grip was wide, and their grasp was thin. On the wild, northern coast of the island of Hispaniola, an island the Spanish had largely abandoned, a new kind of man emerged. They were shipwrecked sailors, escaped indentured servants, and adventurers from France, England, and Holland. They hunted the vast herds of wild boar and cattle that roamed the island. They learned from the native Arawak people how to smoke this meat on a wooden frame called a boucan. The Spanish called these rough, smoke-stained men buccaneers. The English would soon call them buccaneers. At first, they were just hunters, trading their smoked meat and hides to passing ships for gunpowder and rum. But the Spanish saw them as interlopers, as trespassers. They sent soldiers to hunt the buccaneers and, more importantly, to slaughter the animals they lived on. They say that when you take away a man's livelihood, you give him a new one. By destroying their trade, Spain turned these hardened hunters into determined enemies. They took to the sea. They formed a loose confederation known as the Brethren of the Coast. From their new stronghold on the tiny, fortified island of Tortuga, they began to hunt the hunters. They turned their long-barreled muskets from Boers to Spanish captains. As the decades passed, these buccaneers became a weapon. The enemies of Spain, primarily England and France, saw their value. They issued letters of marque, official government documents that turned a pirate into a privateer. The letter gave them permission to attack enemy ships, in exchange for a cut of the profits for the crown. The greatest privateer base in the Caribbean, and perhaps the world, was Port Royal, Jamaica. In the late 1600s, it was known as the richest and wickedest city in the world. It was a city built entirely on pirate plunder. Its taverns were filled with gold, its harbors with stolen ships. The most famous of these government-sponsored pirates was Sir Henry Morgan, a Welshman who led entire armies of buccaneers, sacking Spanish cities and becoming a legend. But the line between a legal privateer and an outlaw pirate was as thin as a cutlass blade. And on June 7, 1692, that line was erased forever. A massive earthquake, followed by a tidal wave, struck Port Royal. The city, built on loose sand, liquefied. Two-thirds of the wickedest city slid beneath the waves in minutes. Thousands died. To the moralists of the day, it was clear, this was divine judgment. To the surviving buccaneers, it was a practical disaster. Their base was gone. Their government sponsors were making peace with Spain. And the Royal Navy, once their ally, now saw them as a nuisance. The age of the privateer was over. Unemployed, unwanted, and possessing a very particular set of skills, these Brethren of the Coast scattered, looking for a new home. A place where they could be their own masters. They found it in the Bahamas. Chapter 2: The Pirate Republic. They needed a fortress. A place the warships of the empires couldn't reach. They found it in Nassau, on the island of New Providence. Nassau was a failed English colony, its governor fled, its defenses in ruins. But its harbor was a strategic masterpiece. It was deep enough for the pirates' fast, shallow-draft ships, their sloops and schooners, but far too shallow for the Royal Navy's massive, heavy warships, which would run aground on the sandbars. Better still, it sat directly on the main shipping lanes. It was a perfect shark's nest. Around the year 1713, this abandoned port became the Pirate Republic. It was a true outlaw state, a ramshackle town of tents, shacks, and salvaged ship timbers, run by the pirates themselves. Here, they could rest, repair their ships, and sell their stolen goods to corrupt merchants from the American colonies. The Republic was dominated by a loose confederation of pirate captains known as the Flying Gang. Their leaders were men like Benjamin Hornigold, a strategic and respected pirate who acted as a sort of unofficial magistrate. And Henry Jennings, his bitter rival. From this base, they launched a reign of terror. And it was here that they trained a new generation of captains, men whose names would become legend. Hornigold's own protege was a tall, imposing sailor with a fearsome reputation. A man named Edward Teach. The world would come to know him as Blackbeard. For a few short years, Nassau was the most dangerous place on earth. It was home to over 1,000 pirates, including figures like the fanatically cruel Charles Vane, who defied all authority. It was a place where a man could be a king one day and dead the next. But what was life really like for these men, and the few women, who lived under the Black Flag? Chapter 3, Life Under the Black Flag. The first thing you must understand is why they chose this life. In the 18th century, life as an ordinary sailor in the Royal Navy or on a merchant ship was a floating nightmare. The pay was miserable, the work backbreaking, and the food was often just hard, weevil-infested biscuits called hardtack and salted meat so tough it was nicknamed salt horse. But worst of all was the discipline. Captains had the power of life and death. A minor offense could be met with a brutal flogging with the cat-o'-nine-tails, a whip that would rip the skin from a man's back. Many sailors were impressed, which is to say, kidnapped off the streets of port cities and forced into service. Piracy was an escape. It was a rebellion. As the famous pirate Bartholomew Roberts said, in an honest service, there is thin commons, low wages, and hard labor. In this, plenty and satiety, pleasure and ease, liberty and power. A merry life and a short one shall be my motto. On a pirate ship, there was no godlike captain. In fact, a pirate ship was one of the most democratic places on earth. When a crew was formed, they all drew up and signed a set of Articles of Agreement. This was the pirate code. It was their law. Every man had a vote in affairs of moment, meaning big decisions, like where to sail or whether to attack a ship. They elected their own officers. The captain was elected, but he only had absolute command during a battle or a chase. For the day-to-day running of the ship, the real power lay with the quartermaster, also elected by the crew. The quartermaster distributed the food, kept order, and, most importantly, divided the plunder. The code laid out the rules. No fighting amongst the crew on board the ship. No bringing women on board in disguise. And a strict policy for dividing the loot. A typical share system might be, 2 shares for the captain, 1.5 for the quartermaster and master gunner, and 1 full share for every other man. The code even included an early form of workers' compensation. It set out fixed payments for injuries sustained in battle. An article from Bartholomew Roberts' crew read, for the loss of a right arm, 600 pieces of 8. For the loss of a left arm, 500 pieces of 8. For a right leg, 500. For a left leg, 400. A lost eye or finger would earn 100 pieces of 8. This was a social contract, a promise of fairness that no navy or merchant vessel offered. But do not mistake this for an easy life. The food was just as bad, unless they had recently captured a ship. Disease, especially scurvy from a lack of vitamin C, was rampant. And if they were captured, the penalty was not a flogging. It was a trial, a guilty verdict, and a dance at the end of a rope, a process they called dying in their shoes. And what of the myths? Walking the plank? That was almost entirely fictional, an invention of later storytellers. A far more common, and more terrible, punishment was marooning. A pirate who cheated his crewmates or showed cowardice would be left on a deserted island, with nothing but a single flask of water, a pistol, and one shot of powder. Chapter 4, A Gallery of Rogues. The Pirate Republic was a constellation of blazing, short-lived stars. Each one burned with a terrifying intensity. First, there was Edward Blackbeard Teach. He was a master of psychological warfare. He knew that a terrifying reputation meant ships would surrender without a fight, saving him powder and shot. He was a tall man, who cultivated a demonic image. Before battle, he would weave hemp fuses, soaked in salt water and brimstone, into his massive black beard and hair. He would light them, and wreathe his face in a cloud of acrid, terrifying smoke. His victims said he looked like an apparition from hell itself. His flagship was a captured 40-gun French frigate he renamed the Queen Anne's Revenge. In 1718, in his most audacious act, he blockaded the entire port of Charleston, South Carolina, holding the city's most prominent citizens for ransom. His demand? Not gold. A chest of medicine for his sick crew. Then there was the most unlikely pirate of all, Stede Bonnet, the gentleman pirate. Bonnet had been a wealthy, educated landowner in Barbados. He had a wife, a family, and a large plantation. Then one day, in 1717, he abandoned it all. He bought his own ship, which he named the Revenge, hired a crew of 70 men, and, with no sailing experience whatsoever, announced he was going to be a pirate. His crew quickly realized their captain didn't know the bow from the stern. He was soon wounded and, in a moment of humiliation, his crew effectively mutinied, turning command over to a more experienced captain who was traveling with them, Blackbeard. For a time, Bonnet was a guest on his own ship, watching as Blackbeard led his crew. Bonnet's story was one of baffling incompetence, ending, as so many did, at the gallows. And what of the most famous legends of all? The women pirates. They were real. Their names were Anne Bonny and Mary Red. Anne Bonny was an Irish woman with a fiery temper who had run off to Nassau with a small-time pirate, leaving her husband behind. There, she fell in love with the dashing, flamboyant captain, Calico Jack Rackham. She joined his crew, dressed as a man, and fought alongside them. Mary Red had a different path. She had spent most of her life disguised as a boy, first by her mother to secure an inheritance, and later as a soldier and sailor in the British military. Her ship was captured by Calico Jack, and she, too, joined his crew, keeping her secret. The legend says that Anne Bonny took a liking to the new, handsome young sailor, Mary Read, and revealed to her that she was a woman. Mary, in turn, was forced to reveal that she was also a woman. Their captain, Calico Jack, grew jealous of their closeness and, storming in on them, demanded an explanation. When they both revealed the truth, he was so impressed by their audacity that he let them both remain. They were said to be two of the most ferocious fighters on the ship. When their ship was finally captured in 1720 by a pirate hunter, the story goes that all the male pirates, including Calico Jack, were drunk and hiding below deck. Only Anne Bonny, Mary Red, and one other man stood on deck to fight. At their trial, Calico Jack and his male crew were sentenced to hang. Anne Bonny's last words to her lover were not sweet. "I am sorry to see you here," she said, "but if you had fought like a man, you need not have been hanged like a dog." And then Mary also stood trial. But when sentenced to hang, they both revealed a secret to the judge. "My lord," they said, "we plead our bellies." They were both pregnant. English law forbade the execution of an unborn child. Their executions were stayed. Mary Red died in prison, likely of a fever. The fate of Anne Bonny is a mystery. All records of her simply vanish. Finally, there was Bartholomew "Black Bart" Roberts. He was, by far, the most successful pirate of the age. He captured over 400 ships in just a few years. He was a tall, dashing man who dressed in rich silks and wore a diamond cross. He was also a strict disciplinarian. His articles famously forbade gambling, and demanded that all lights be put out at 8 p.m. He drank tea instead of rum. His death in battle in 1722, off the coast of Africa, is considered by many historians to be the final act, the true end of the Golden Age. Chapter 5, The End of the Golden Age. No republic built on theft can last forever. The empires struck back. The pirates of the Flying Gang had become more than a nuisance, they were a direct threat to the entire Atlantic economy. The merchants and plantation owners of London and Bristol demanded action. In 1718, the King of England offered a solution in two parts. The first was a carrot, the King's pardon. Any pirate who surrendered to a British governor by September 5, 1718, would be given a full pardon for all their crimes. The second part was the stick. A former privateer, a determined and iron-willed man named Woodes Rogers, was appointed governor of the Bahamas. He sailed for Nassau with a fleet of Royal Navy warships. When Rogers arrived, the pirate republic descended into chaos. Some, like Benjamin Hornigold, saw the writing on the wall. They accepted the pardon and even turned pirate hunter for the governor. Others were defiant. The fierce Charles Vane, refusing to surrender, set his own flagship on fire and sailed it directly into Rogers' fleet, using the confusion to blast his way out of the harbor and escape. But the tide had turned. Woodes Rogers took Nassau, tore down the shacks, and built a fort. He restored order with a heavy hand. His new motto for the colony was, Expulsus Piratus, Restituta Commercia. Pirates expelled, commerce restored. The hunt was on. The pardon turned on the unpardoned. Blackbeard, who had at first accepted the pardon, quickly grew bored and returned to piracy. He was cornered by the Navy in a shallow inlet in North Carolina. In a final, bloody battle, he was shot 5 times and cut more than 20, fighting to the very end before he finally fell. His head was cut off and hung from the bowsprit of his enemy's ship. Stede Bonnet was captured and hanged. Calico Jack was captured and hanged. One by one, the great captains of the Golden Age were hunted down, brought to trial, and executed. That merry life had indeed been a short one. Conclusion. The Golden Age of Piracy, that brief, explosive era, lasted barely 30 years. It was the span of a single generation. By 1726, it was over. The Caribbean sea lanes were secure, patrolled by the all-powerful Royal Navy. The surviving pirates were scattered, dead, or had vanished back into the slums of the port cities they came from. But their legacy is immortal. They were not, perhaps, good men. They were thieves and, at times, murderers. But they were also rebels. They were common sailors who rose up against a brutal and oppressive system. In their floating wooden worlds, they created something that existed almost nowhere else, a life of liberty, equality, and a share of the wealth. They created a brief, democratic, and surprisingly multi-ethnic society on the high seas, where a man was judged not by his birth, but by his courage and his willingness to sign the articles. The next time you see the turquoise water of the Caribbean, look closely. Listen to the wind in the rigging of a passing sailboat. You might just hear the echo of a sea shanty, and the defiant roar of the Flying Gang.